The thing about living on an ice moon at the edge of civilized space is that nobody knocks on your door unless something has gone catastrophically wrong. And Ryan, grizzled, bitter, and approximately 3 whiskeys deep into forgetting why he'd left Earth in the first place, knew this with the certainty of a man who'd made a career out of bad decisions. Kimura 5 wasn't the kind of place you ended up by accident. It was the kind of place you crawled to when everywhere else had kicked you out. When your past had teeth, and you needed a few thousand light years between you and your mistakes. The ice moon was a patchwork colony of prefab hab units clinging to the surface like barnacles on a dying ship, all huddled beneath a flickering atmospheric dome that kept the atmosphere breathable and the temperature merely unbearable instead of instantly lethal. Outside that dome, temperatures that would crystallize your spit before it hit the ground, winds that could flay the skin off your bones, storms that lasted weeks and turned the landscape into a howling white nightmare where up and down became polite suggestions rather than facts. Perfect place for a freight hauler with nothing left to lose, and even less to live for. Ryan's hab unit was exactly as depressing as you'd expect. Cramped, cold, despite the heating unit's valiant efforts, and decorated in what interior designers might charitably call aggressively masculine, but what was really just too tired to care. A bunk that had seen better decades, a table with one wobbly leg, a viewport that looked out onto an endless expanse of ice and darkness, and a bottle of whiskey that was rapidly approaching empty, which was frankly the most tragic part of this entire setup. He was contemplating the philosophical implications of his last drink. Pour it now, or save it for when things got worse, because they always got worse. When the knocking started. Not a polite knock. Not a hello neighbor knock. A desperate, frantic pounding that made the thin metal door rattle in its frame like it was trying to escape. Ryan's first instinct, honed by months of antisocial behavior and a general distrust of the universe, was to ignore it. Whatever crisis existed on the other side of that door was someone else's problem. He'd done his time playing hero. He had the scars and the nightmares to prove it. He was retired from giving a damn. The knocking continued. Persistent little thing, whatever it was. "Go away," Ryan called out, not bothering to move from his chair. "Colony administration is 3 units down. File a complaint form. They'll ignore it in the order it was received." The knocking stopped. Ryan allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. See? Problem solved. He reached for his glass. Then came the crying. Not adult crying. That he could have ignored. Adults cried all the time on Kimura 5. It was practically the colony anthem. But this was a child's crying, the kind that hit frequencies specifically, designed by evolution to make humans feel like absolute garbage for not helping. Damn it! Ryan hauled himself out of his chair with the enthusiasm of a man approaching his own execution, and yanked open the door. Standing in the corridor, barely reaching his waist, was a Draken child. Now, Drakens were one of the more visually impressive species in the galactic community. Imagine if someone took a dragon from human mythology, gave it opposable thumbs and a working knowledge of quantum mechanics, and then shrunk it down to roughly human size. Scales that shimmered in colors ranging from deep crimson to burnished gold. Wings that could fold tight against their backs, or spread wide enough to glide in low gravity. Eyes that were a bit too large, a bit too knowing, with slit pupils that could dilate to catch every photon of light. This particular Draken was small, even for a child. Her scales were a dusty copper color, dulled by cold and fear. Her wings were tucked so tight against her back, they were almost invisible beneath her inadequate thermal wrap. and her eyes, huge and golden, and currently leaking tears that froze into tiny crystals on her cheeks, were fixed on Ryan with the desperate hope of someone who'd run out of options. "Sir," she managed between sobs, her voice high and cracking. "Sir, please, Mama didn't come home." And there it was, the universe's cosmic joke. Ryan had fled halfway across the galaxy to avoid responsibility, to avoid caring, to avoid the soul-crushing weight of other people's problems, and here was a crying dragon child on his doorstep, because apparently the universe had a sense of humor, and it was terrible. "Kid," Ryan said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "You got the wrong door. I don't do—" He gestured vaguely. "Whatever this is, try the Colony Watch, or Family Services, or literally anyone else." "I tried." Tilly, though Ryan didn't know her name yet, wailed. "Nobody will help. They said Mama hasn't been gone long enough. They said to wait. But it's cold, and it's dark, and Mama always comes home, and she didn't, and—" The words tumbled out in a rush, tripping over each other in their desperation to be heard. Ryan felt something uncomfortable twist in his chest. Conscience, probably. Useless thing. He'd tried to drown it in whiskey and bad decisions, but apparently it was more resilient than expected. Okay. Stop. Just stop crying for a second." He held up his hands in surrender. "Come inside before you freeze to death in the hallway. And wipe your face. You're getting ice crystals everywhere." Tilly stumbled into the HAB unit, looking around with the wide-eyed confusion of a child trying to process too many emotions at once. Ryan shut the door and immediately regretted every life choice that had led to this moment. "Sit," he said, pointing at the chair he'd just vacated. "Talk, slowly. Use your words like a person, not like a fire alarm." Tilly climbed into the chair. It was too big for her, making her look even smaller, and took a shuddering breath. "My mama is Kessa. She works the deep ice mining tunnels on the far side of the colony. Tunnel 23K. She left this morning before the sun came up, not that the sun comes up much here, and she said she'd be home for dinner. But she didn't come home. And I waited and waited, and she still didn't come home." Ryan glanced at the chronometer on the wall. Late evening, colony time. How long? 6 hours passed when she should have been back. 6 hours. In the deep ice tunnels, where temperatures could drop even lower than the surface, where structural collapses were common, where— No, not his problem. He was not doing this. "The colony has protocols," Ryan said, forcing his voice to stay level. "Search and rescue won't deploy until someone's been missing for 48 hours. It's standard procedure across most frontier colonies. Expensive to send out teams every time someone's late for dinner." "But Mama wouldn't be late," Tilly insisted, her voice rising again. "She's never late. She always comes home. Always." Maybe she picked up an extra shift. Maybe she stopped to talk to someone. Maybe— "I went to the other Draken families," Tilly interrupted. And now there was something harder in her voice, something that sounded too old for a child. "I asked them to help look for Mama. They said no. They said Mama made her choice when she took dangerous work. They said it's not their problem." Ah, there it was. The ugly truth that every frontier colony tried to hide beneath platitudes about community and cooperation. When resources were scarce and survival was a daily struggle, compassion became a luxury most couldn't afford. Kessa. The name tickled something in Ryan's memory. He frowned, trying to pull it out of the whiskey-soaked fog of the past few months. "Your mother," he said slowly. "Kessa. Copper scales, about this tall?" He held his hand up to indicate height. Works the deep tunnels, even though it pays garbage, because the shifts are flexible. Tilly nodded eagerly. You know her? Ryan did know her. Or rather, he remembered her. From when he'd first arrived on Komora 5, broke and broken, with nothing but the clothes on his back and a freighter full of bad memories. He'd been sitting outside the colony commissary, trying to figure out if he had enough credits for food or if he'd be going hungry for the third day in a row. Kessa had walked past, noticed him, really noticed him, not just glanced, and kept walking like everyone else, and without a word had handed him a container of hot food. Real food, not the nutrient paste that passed for sustenance in the cheap hab units. When he'd tried to refuse, she'd just smiled and said, "Everyone needs help sometimes. No shame in it." He'd never paid her back, never even thanked her properly. Just took the food and added it to the long list of debts he'd never settle. Damn it. Damn it. Your mother, Ryan said carefully, is a good person, which means she's probably in trouble, because good people have terrible survival instincts. Tilly's eyes went even wider, if that was possible. You'll help? You'll help find Mama? Every logical, rational, self-preserving part of Ryan's brain was screaming at him to say no. To explain that the frozen wastes outside the colony dome were lethal, that the mining tunnels were unstable death traps, that going out in the middle of the night in a blizzard to search for someone who was probably already dead was the kind of stupid that got you killed. But humans, as the galaxy had learned over the past few decades of contact, were not particularly good at listening to logic. I'll take a look, Ryan heard himself say, and immediately wanted to punch himself. But I'm not promising anything. If the tunnels collapsed, or if she fell into a crevasse, there's nothing I can do. Understand? Tilly nodded so hard her whole body shook. Yes, yes, I understand. Thank you, sir. Thank you. Stop calling me sir. Name's Ryan. He moved to the storage locker in the corner and started pulling out his thermal gear. The heavy-duty stuff, rated for extended exposure to Komora 5's surface. You're going to stay here where it's warm and... No! Tilly was out of the chair in an instant. I'm coming with you. I know where Mama works. I know the paths. Absolutely not. It's dangerous out there. You'll freeze or fall or... I'm Draken. Tilly spread her wings for emphasis, and despite their small size, they were impressive. We're cold-resistant, and I know the way better than you do. Mama taught me all the routes in case of emergency. Ryan wanted to argue, wanted to put his foot down and be the responsible adult. But he looked at Tilly's determined face, at the set of her jaw and the fire in her eyes, and recognized something he'd seen in the mirror too many times. Stubbornness. The kind that didn't bend, didn't break, didn't listen to reason. Fine, he said, because arguing with a determined child was like arguing with physics. Technically possible, but ultimately pointless. But you do exactly what I say, when I say it. No arguments, no heroics. We're looking for your mother, not trying to win medals for stupidity. Clear. Clear! Ryan finished strapping on his thermal gear, checked his portable beacon and scanner, and grabbed his emergency pack. He looked at Tilly, small and determined, and absolutely unprepared for what they were about to face. Last chance to stay here where it's safe, he offered. Tilly shook her head. Mama needs us. Yeah, Ryan muttered, heading for the door. She probably does. They stepped out of the hab unit and into the colony's main corridor. A few other residents were out, a Quilvan merchant closing up shop, a human couple arguing in hushed tones, a Fexian maintenance worker checking conduit lines. They all glanced at Ryan and Tilly, noted the thermal gear, and quickly looked away. Nobody asked where they were going. Nobody offered to help. That was frontier life. Everyone had their own problems, their own struggles. Survival was a solo sport. They reached the colony's outer airlock, the threshold between relative safety and absolute hostility. Ryan keyed in his access code, and the inner door hissed open. "Once we're outside," he said, crouching down to Tilly's level, "visibility is going to be terrible. The wind is going to be loud. You hold onto my belt, and you don't let go for any reason. If I stop, you stop. If I move, you move. Got it?" Tilly nodded, her earlier bravado fading slightly as the reality of what they were about to do set in. Ryan stood and cycled the airlock. The outer door opened, and the frozen night of Camorra 5 reached in with icy fingers and howling voice. They stepped through, and the door sealed behind them with a finality that sounded a lot like a coffin closing. The blizzard hit them like a physical force, wind that screamed and tore at their clothes, snow that wasn't soft and gentle but sharp and cutting, like tiny knives. Temperature that dropped so fast Ryan's exposed skin went numb in seconds. This was Camorra 5. Beautiful in the way that things that could kill you were often beautiful. Deadly in the way that made you understand why humans had spent millennia huddled around fires, terrified of the dark and the cold. Tilly grabbed onto Ryan's belt with both hands, her small body pressed against his leg for warmth and stability. Ryan activated his beacon, checked his scanner, and looked out into the howling white darkness. "All right, kid," he shouted over the wind, "show me where your mama works." And together, a broken human and a desperate dragon child walked into the frozen night, because sometimes the stupidest decisions are the only ones worth making. The cold on Camorra 5 wasn't just cold, it was personal. It reached through thermal gear and insulated layers with the determination of a bill collector, finding every gap, every weakness, every exposed millimeter of skin. Ryan had been on ice worlds before, had done tours on stations where warm was a theoretical concept, but Camorra 5 took it to another level entirely. This was the kind of cold that made you understand why ancient humans had invented hell as a hot place. At least fire had the decency to kill you quickly. "Which way?" Ryan shouted over the wind, his words torn away almost before they left his mouth. Tilly pointed with one hand while keeping her death grip on his belt with the other. "Northeast, past the old mining equipment graveyard." Of course it was northeast. The worst direction, naturally. The direction where the wind hit hardest and the terrain got treacherous. Because the universe had a sense of humor, and it was awful. They trudged forward, each step a negotiation with gravity and ice. Ryan's scanner was practically useless. Too much interference from the storm. Too much frozen rock, playing havoc with the sensors. His beacon cut through the darkness in a pitiful cone of light that showed mostly swirling snow and occasional glimpses of jagged ice formations. Tilly, to her credit, kept pace. Her Draken physiology gave her some advantage against the cold. Their homeworld was no tropical paradise. But she was still a child, still small, still struggling against wind that wanted to pick her up and throw her into the darkness like unwanted trash. "You know," Ryan muttered, more to himself than to Tilly. Most species in the galaxy would look at this situation and say no. They'd calculate the odds, assess the risk, and make the logical choice to stay inside where it's warm, and survival is likely. "What?" Tilly shouted, barely audible. "Nothing, just commenting on human stupidity." And it was stupid, monumentally, spectacularly stupid. The galaxy had learned this about humans over the past few decades of contact. They were the species that looked at terrible odds and said, "Yeah, but what if we tried anyway?" They were the ones who'd go into hostile environments with inadequate equipment and excessive confidence. They were the ones who'd risk everything for people they barely knew, for reasons that made sense only in the moment and never upon reflection. Other species found this either admirable or insane, usually both. The Quilvan, with their 3 brains and mathematical approach to existence, had published papers on human decision-making that essentially concluded humans operated on spite and emotional reasoning rather than logic. The Phexians, who'd built an empire on careful planning and risk assessment, considered humans to be chaos incarnate. And the Drakans, well, the Drakans respected strength and honor, and humans had both in quantities that made up for their lack of scales and fire breath. Ryan represented the typical human paradox perfectly, simultaneously self-destructive and heroic, running toward danger because standing still felt worse. They reached the equipment graveyard, a field of broken mining machines half buried in ice and snow. Massive drills that had given up the ghost. Haulers with frozen treads. All the dreams of profitable mining operations abandoned when the reality of Kimura 5's hostility became too expensive to ignore. "Through here!" Tilly pulled on his belt, guiding him between the mechanical corpses. The wind howled through the metal skeletons, creating sounds that were almost musical if you ignored the part where they sounded like screaming. Ryan's thermal readout was dropping. They'd been outside for 20 minutes, and already his core temperature was starting to dip into the concerning range. "How much further?" he called back. "Another half-kilometer. There's a crevasse field, then the tunnel entrance." A crevasse field. Fantastic. Because this wasn't dangerous enough already. They emerged from the graveyard, and immediately the terrain changed. The relatively flat expanse gave way to broken, fractured ice, evidence of geological activity, of the moon's surface constantly shifting and cracking under tidal stresses from the gas giant it orbited. Ryan stopped, pulling out his scanner and adjusting the settings. The interference was still bad, but he managed to get a topographical reading. The crevasses showed up as dark lines on the display, some narrow enough to step over, others wide enough to swallow a building. "We have to cross that?" he asked, already knowing the answer. "Mama does it every day," Tilly said, and there was pride in her voice despite the fear. "She's really brave." "Brave is one word for it," Ryan muttered. "Reckless is another." But he understood. When you had a kid to feed and bills to pay, you did the dangerous work. You took the shifts nobody else wanted. You crossed crevasse fields in the dark because the alternative was watching your child go hungry. Kessa wasn't reckless. She was desperate. And desperation made people do things that looked like courage from the outside. They approached the first crevasse, a crack in the ice about 2 meters wide, disappearing into darkness below. Ryan shined his light down and saw nothing but black. Could be 10 meters deep. Could be 100. Either way, falling in meant not coming back out. "There are ice bridges," Tilly explained, pointing. "Natural formations. Mama taught me which ones are stable." Ryan looked where she indicated and saw them. Narrow spans of ice connecting one side of the crevasse to the other, formed by snow accumulation and freezing meltwater. They looked about as trustworthy as a politician's promise. "You're sure they're stable?" "Mama and I crossed them 2 weeks ago. They were fine then." 2 weeks was a lifetime on Kimura 5. The ice shifted constantly. What was stable yesterday could be death today. But they didn't have a choice. Not really. Not if they wanted to reach the tunnels. "All right," Ryan said, testing the first bridge with his boot. It held. "I'll go first. You wait until I'm across, then you follow. Understand?" "I can make it." "I know you can. But we do this careful and slow, or we don't do it at all." Ryan stepped onto the ice bridge, distributing his weight carefully, moving with the deliberate slowness of someone who understood that haste and gravity were a fatal combination. The bridge creaked, but held. 3 steps. 5. 8. He reached the other side and turned back. Your turn. Slow and steady. Tilly stepped onto the bridge, her lighter weight actually an advantage here. She moved with the confidence of someone who'd done this before, who trusted the ice because her mother had taught her to trust it. Halfway across, the wind gusted hard. Tilly wobbled, her wings instinctively spreading for balance. "Don't stop," Ryan called. "Keep moving." She did, reaching his side with only a small stumble at the end. Ryan caught her, steadied her. "Good," he said. "How many more?" "3 more big ones. Then we're at the tunnel entrance." 3 more. 3 more chances to fall into darkness. 3 more opportunities for the universe to remind them that this was a terrible idea. They crossed them all, each one a small eternity of careful steps, and held breath. By the time they reached solid ground on the far side of the crevasse field, Ryan's hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. "There!" Tilly pointed ahead, and Ryan's light caught the entrance to Tunnel 23K, or what was left of it. The entrance was partially collapsed. Ice and rock spilled across the opening like a frozen waterfall. Recent, too. The edges were still sharp, not yet smoothed by wind and time. Ryan pulled out his scanner and aimed it at the tunnel. The interference was worse here, all the rock and ice playing havoc with the signal. But after a moment, the display flickered and showed something. A faint life sign. Deep inside. Weak, but present. "She's in there," Ryan said, and felt that uncomfortable twist in his chest again. "Your mama's in there." Tilly made a sound that was half sob, half laugh. "She's alive! We have to get her out." Ryan looked at the collapsed entrance, at the unstable ice, at the darkness beyond. Every instinct screamed that going in there was suicide. The tunnel could collapse completely at any moment. They had no proper equipment, no backup, no way to call for help if things went wrong. The smart move, the logical move, was to go back to the colony, report the location, wait for proper rescue teams with proper equipment. He looked down at Tilly's hopeful face, at the trust in her eyes. "Yeah," Ryan said, because humans were terrible at making smart moves. "We have to get her out." They approached the tunnel entrance, and Ryan wondered if this was how it ended, frozen and buried on an ice moon at the edge of nowhere, because he couldn't say no to a crying child. Probably, he thought, there were worse ways to go. The entrance to Tunnel 23K looked like the mouth of something that had died badly and was now waiting to take company with it into the afterlife. Ice and rock had cascaded down in a partial collapse, leaving gaps just wide enough for a determined or suicidal person to squeeze through. Ryan's headlamp illuminated crystalline walls that glittered with false beauty, the kind that made you forget you were looking at a tomb in progress. "Stay close," Ryan said, checking his gear one last time. "And if I say run, you run. Don't argue. Don't look back. Just move. Clear?" "Clear," Tilly whispered, her earlier confidence fading now that they were actually here, actually doing this insane thing. They squeezed through the largest gap in the collapse, ice scraping against Ryan's thermal gear with sounds like fingernails on metal. The tunnel beyond was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 people to walk side by side, and the ceiling was low enough that Ryan had to duck. Support beams lined the walls at irregular intervals, some still holding strong, others bent and twisted from the collapse. The temperature somehow felt colder inside than it had outside, which shouldn't have been possible but absolutely was. The kind of cold that seeped into bones and made them ache. The kind that made you understand why ancient humans had feared the dark, because darkness and cold were cousins, and both wanted you dead. "Mama!" Tilly called out, her voice echoing down the tunnel. "Mama, we're here!" The tunnel groaned in response, a deep sound that came from everywhere and nowhere, the voice of unstable ice and rock, deciding whether to kill them now or later. "Maybe less shouting," Ryan suggested quietly. "Sound can trigger collapses." They moved deeper. Ryan's scanner held out in front like a talisman against the dark. The life sign was stronger now, more defined. Definitely Draken physiology. Definitely deeper in the tunnel, past where the main collapse had occurred. The walls here were marked with mining equipment, abandoned drills, empty ore containers, the occasional tool left behind when the shift ended. Evidence of Kessa's work, of the dangerous labor she did every day to keep her daughter fed and warm. "How far does this tunnel go?" Ryan asked. "Mama said it goes down about 200 meters, then branches into 3 smaller tunnels. She usually works the middle branch." 200 meters into an unstable ice tunnel. Fantastic. This just kept getting better. They passed through a section where the ceiling had partially collapsed, leaving a gap barely large enough to crawl through. Ryan went first, his pack scraping against ice, his breath coming in short gasps as claustrophobia tried to make friends with his brain. He emerged on the other side and helped pull Tilly through. "I don't like this," Tilly said, and her voice was small, childlike in a way it hadn't been before. "Yeah, well, join the club. We're all getting matching jackets." They continued, and the tunnel opened up slightly, enough that Ryan could stand fully upright, enough that the oppressive weight of ice above them felt slightly less immediate. His light caught something on the ground ahead. A mining tool. Kessa's, probably. Dropped or abandoned in haste. Then another tool. And another. She was running, Ryan said, reading the evidence like a trail. Something made her drop her equipment and run. "Run from what?" Tilly asked, pressing closer to Ryan's side. That was an excellent question with probably terrible answers. The deep tunnels of Kimura 5 were supposed to be empty, just ice and rock, and the occasional mineral deposit worth mining. But supposed to be and actually are were two very different things, and frontier colonies had a habit of discovering the difference at the worst possible moments. They reached the branch point Tilly had mentioned, 3 tunnels splitting off from the main shaft, each one darker and less inviting than the last. Ryan checked his scanner. The life sign was coming from the middle tunnel. "That one," he said, pointing. They entered the middle branch, and immediately the character of the tunnel changed. The walls here were rougher, less finished. This was newer excavation, less stable. Water had seeped through cracks and frozen into bizarre formations, creating ice sculptures that looked almost organic in the lamplight. "Mama!" Tilly called again, unable to help herself. "Mama, where are you?" This time there was an answer. "Tilly?" The voice was weak, pained, but unmistakably Draken. "Tilly, baby, is that you?" "Mama!" Tilly tried to run forward, but Ryan caught her. "Slow," he said firmly. "We don't know what we're walking into." They moved forward carefully, and Ryan's light finally found her. Kessa was trapped under a fallen support beam, pinned from the waist down. Her copper scales were dulled with pain and cold. Her wings spread awkwardly on the ground. She'd been using her own body heat to keep from freezing solid. Ryan could see the slight shimmer of warmth around her, the way the ice near her body had melted and refrozen in patterns. "Oh, thank the ancestors," Kessa breathed when she saw them. Then her eyes widened in horror. "No, no, you shouldn't be here. Tilly, you need to leave. You need to get out." "We're not leaving without you," Tilly said, rushing to her mother's side. Ryan knelt down and assessed the situation with the practiced eye of someone who'd seen too many disasters. The beam was heavy, solid metal reinforced with ice. It had Kessa's leg pinned, and from the angle and the way she was breathing, the leg was badly crushed. She'd been here for hours, using every bit of her Draken resilience to stay alive. "Can you move it?" Kessa asked, looking at Ryan with eyes that held more hope than they should. Ryan tested the beam, putting his weight against it. It didn't budge, not even slightly. And the way it was positioned, wedged between the floor and a partially collapsed section of ceiling, moving it might bring down the entire tunnel. "Not without equipment I don't have," Ryan admitted. "But I've got another idea." He pulled out his thermal charges, small devices meant for emergency heating, capable of generating intense localized heat for short periods. Normally used to thaw frozen equipment or create warm zones in emergency shelters. But heat melted ice, and ice was what was holding this beam in place. "You're going to melt the ice around the beam," Kessa said, understanding immediately. "That's incredibly dangerous. If you use too much heat, the whole tunnel comes down." "Yeah, I'm aware." Ryan positioned the first charge carefully, right where the beam met the frozen floor. "But unless you've got a better idea, this is what we're working with." Kessa looked at her daughter, then back at Ryan. If this goes wrong, we all die together." Very democratic. Ryan set the second. "Charge on the opposite side. But I'm pretty good at not dying, so let's stay optimistic." He activated the charges, and immediately the temperature in the immediate area began to rise. Ice started to melt, water trickling down in small streams that refroze almost instantly when they moved away from the heat source. The beam shifted slightly, settling as the ice beneath it liquefied. "Almost there," Ryan muttered, watching the beam carefully. "Just a little more." That's when they heard it. Movement. From deeper in the tunnel. Something large. Something that definitely shouldn't be there. Tilly heard it too. "What is that?" "Nothing good," Ryan said, his hand moving instinctively to the mining laser on his belt, a tool designed for cutting ice, not for fighting, but better than nothing. The sound came again. Closer. A scraping, clicking sound that echoed off the ice walls. Then it emerged into the light. The Ixlith was everything nightmares were made of when they decided to get serious about their job. Roughly the size of a large human, but built low to the ground like a predator designed by committee. All claws and chitinous armor, and too many joints in its legs. Its head was eyeless, because eyes were useless in the deep tunnels, but its mouth was very much present, a circular arrangement of teeth that rotated like a drill bit. Native to Camorra 5, supposedly rare, supposedly avoided the mining tunnels, supposedly was having a really bad day. "Oh, that's what she was running from," Ryan said with the calm of someone whose day had just gone from terrible to catastrophic. "Tilly, get behind me, now." The Ixlith's head swiveled toward them, tracking by sound and heat. It made a sound like grinding metal, and Ryan realized it was probably how the thing communicated. Or maybe it was just hungry. Hard to tell with alien predators. "The charges," Kessa said urgently. "You have to finish." "Working on it." Ryan pulled out his mining laser, thumbing it to maximum power. The beam was designed to cut through ice over several seconds. Against an armored predator? Probably useless. But humans had a long history of fighting things that should definitely eat them, and Ryan was about to add another entry to that list. The Ixlith charged. Ryan fired the laser, the beam catching the creature in what he hoped was its face. It shrieked, definitely a pain sound, and veered to the side, crashing into the tunnel wall hard enough to send ice chips flying. Not so tough, Ryan shouted, because apparently his survival instinct had completely given up, and his mouth was now running on pure adrenaline. The Ixlith recovered faster than anything that size should, spinning around with its drill mouth leading. Ryan dove to the side, felt claws scrape across his thermal gear, heard the fabric tear. Cold air hit his side like a punch. The gear was compromised. He had minutes before hypothermia became a real problem. "Ryan!" Tilly screamed. The Ixlith was between him and Kessa now, its attention split between multiple heat sources. It didn't know which target to prioritize, which was the only reason they were all still alive. Ryan's mind raced. The laser wasn't enough. The tunnel was too unstable to risk explosives. The thermal charges were still working on the beam, but not fast enough. Then he looked up at the ceiling, at the cracks spreading through the ice, at the way the whole structure was barely holding together. Terrible idea. Absolutely suicidal. Perfect. "Tilly!" Ryan shouted. "When I say run, you grab your mama and you drag her toward the entrance. Don't stop. Don't look back. But just do it!" Ryan pulled out his remaining thermal charges, the ones he'd been saving for the trip back, for emergency warmth. He activated them all at once and threw them at the ceiling directly above the Ixlith. The creature looked up. Could it look up without eyes? Didn't matter, as the charges hit the ice and began pumping out heat at maximum output. The ceiling groaned, cracked, started to give way. "Run!" Ryan screamed. "Now!" He dove for Kessa, grabbed the beam that had her pinned. The ice around it had melted enough. Barely, just barely enough. He heaved with every bit of strength he had, with the desperate power of someone who knew this was their last chance. The beam shifted, lifted. Kessa screamed as her crushed leg came free. Above them, the ceiling collapsed. Ice and rock came down in a roaring avalanche right on top of the Ixlith. The creature shrieked once, then was buried under tons of frozen debris. "Move!" Ryan hauled Kessa up, threw her arm over his shoulder. Tilly grabbed her mother's other side. Together they ran, stumbled, really, as the tunnel collapsed behind them like a wave of destruction chasing them toward the entrance. Ryan's lungs burned. His side was going numb from cold. His legs felt like they were made of lead. But they ran. The tunnel exit appeared ahead, that beautiful, terrible gap in the collapsed entrance. They threw themselves through it just as the final section of tunnel gave way, with a sound like the world ending. They tumbled out onto the frozen surface of Camorra 5, into the blizzard, into the howling wind. But they were out. They were alive. Ryan lay on his back, staring up at the swirling snow, and started laughing. Because what else could you do when you'd just survived something that stupid? "You're insane," Kessa gasped beside him. "Completely insane." "Yeah," Ryan agreed. "It's a human thing. We're working on it." Tilly was crying again, but this time from relief, her small body pressed between her mother and Ryan like she could keep them both safe through sheer determination. They'd made it. Against all odds, against all logic, they'd actually made it. Now they just had to make it back to the colony before they all froze to death. One problem at a time. Getting out of the tunnel was the easy part. Getting back to the colony with an injured Draken, a traumatized child, and compromised thermal gear in the middle of a blizzard? That was the real test of human stubbornness. Ryan fashioned a makeshift stretcher from his thermal cloak and a piece of support beam he'd grabbed on the way out. Not ideal, but better than dragging Kessa through the ice. Her leg was in bad shape, crushed and swelling despite the cold. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring things in the Draken language that Ryan didn't understand but recognized as pain. Stay with me, he kept saying, more to himself than to her. We didn't come all this way for you to quit now. Tilly walked beside the stretcher, one hand on her mother's arm, the other clutching Ryan's belt again. She was exhausted, running on fumes and fear, but she kept moving, stubborn, just like her mother. The trek back was a nightmare painted in white and black. Ryan's exposed side was going numb, hypothermia creeping in with patient inevitability. His muscles screamed. His lungs felt like they were full of ice shards, but he kept pulling the stretcher, one step at a time, because stopping meant dying, and he'd already committed to the stupid decision of staying alive. They were halfway across the crevasse field when Ryan saw lights. Multiple lights, moving toward them through the storm. Colony patrol. Finally doing their job, probably alerted by the tunnel collapse or Ryan's emergency beacon. "Over here!" Ryan shouted, waving his arm. The patrol reached them. 3 figures in heavy thermal gear, professional rescue equipment, the works. They took one look at the situation and immediately moved into action. One of them took the stretcher from Ryan. Another scooped up Tilly. The third supported Ryan, who was suddenly aware of just how close to collapse he actually was. "You're the idiot who went out in this?" the patrol leader asked, voice muffled by his mask. "That's me," Ryan managed. "Professional idiot. It's on my resume." They made it back to the colony in a fraction of the time it had taken Ryan and Tilly to make the journey out. The airlock had never looked so beautiful. The warm air inside hit Ryan like a physical force, and his legs finally gave out. Medical teams were waiting. They took Kessa immediately, rushing her toward the clinic. Tilly tried to follow, but a medic caught her, started checking her for injuries. "She's going to be okay," the medic said gently. "Your mama's going to be okay." Ryan sat on the floor of the airlock, back against the wall, and watched the organized chaos. His side hurt. His everything hurt. But they'd made it. All 3 of them. Alive. Someone draped a thermal blanket over his shoulders. Someone else was asking him questions. "What happened? How long were you out there? Do you need medical attention?" Ryan answered on autopilot, his brain still catching up to the fact that they'd survived. Tilly appeared in front of him suddenly, having escaped her medic. She looked at him with those huge golden eyes, and then she hugged him, just threw her small arms around his neck, and held on like he was the only solid thing in a shifting universe. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for bringing Mama home." Ryan's throat tightened. He patted her back awkwardly, because he'd never been good at this, at accepting gratitude or affection or any of the soft things that made life worth living. "Yeah, kid," he said quietly. "Anytime."